I am the town sheriff. A couple of weeks ago, I was informed by the FBI that there will be a family moving into my town that would be a part of the witness protection program. I wasn't given much detail other than I had to help check in on this family every other day or so, whether it was by driving by or texting one of the parents daily. I was told that they had some involvement with organized crime, whether it was with gangs or mafia. I'm not quite sure. I did notice on one of my early morning patrols of that family that the family had a daughter who seemed to be young and unassuming of the true horrors that the world had to offer. She was standing outside waiting for the school bus as I drove by. At this point, I had never seen her with any other children. I just assumed that she was an only child. The family was assigned to live on the more outskirts part of the town that nestled up to a thick forest that ended our town boundaries. Having grown up in this town, I had heard stories of some ancient evil living in those woods, but growing up I was always skeptical. I was friends with the game warden and he told me other than the occasional stray pack of wolves or the drugged out homeless people that would sometimes live out there was nothing really to be afraid of. However, it did make the housing costs for those looking to buy near the forest much cheaper. Every town has that one story that never seems to die. A story much like a festering wound that once started as something small, now causing way more damage than the initial wound. A story to cause all nearby locals to reconsider entering the woods, especially at night. In the late 70s, there was that one incident in the forest that resulted in a mass killing of cult members. I was only a child at the time, but my uncle, who was on the force, told my dad. My father ended up telling me that about 13 people were eaten alive that were tied to trees out in those woods. At least that's what he told me one night laid around a campfire. Ever since then, the people in the town claim to hear screams coming from the woods at night, or even hearing their names being called. Apparently, if you follow the voices, then something is supposed to come and get you, but that's something I never did believe. Nonetheless, all the statements were something I could never verify nor confirm for myself. They were all secondhand stories that I've heard from other people. Seeing how the witness protection family had no idea about the dark history, it always seemed wrong that I couldn't technically inform them of what they were living next to. However, thankfully for them, they were taking the identity of corn farmers, and had a good bit of cornfields as a buffer between them and the forest. They weren't actually farmers, so they would have no business being out in those fields anyways. For whatever reason, the family seemed to be rather important to the FBI. I was given access to their security system that linked into my phone. It was supposed to be faster than calling 911. One day, seemingly out of the blue, the father of the family came by the station to inform me that he and his wife will be leaving town for the weekend and wanted me to keep an eye on his daughter. Seeing how he was genuinely concerned, I informed him that I was already keeping a soft patrol on his family, but I could definitely beef things up for him since that there will be no parents at the house. I think it was out of my place to ask, but I did it anyways. Have you or your family had any issues living near those woods? I know the cornfields are much closer, but do you ever hear anything at night? The father looked surprised and he told me that he and his wife hadn't really noticed anything. And his daughter, well, she was deaf. I don't know if you know this, but the folklore of this town is that there's something in those woods next to those cornfields. They try to call out to people. If you listen to the voices, then something is supposed to come and get you. The father gave me a light and white smile. I could tell he thought less of me for believing in something as crazy as a creature calling out to you, but that was something everyone in this town believed. I just thought to get him on the same page. Well, what kind of creature is it supposed to be? He asked, almost mockingly. I shook my head and pulled out a pad and pen and wrote down the word, seeing that I didn't want to say it out loud. He read it and laughed even more. Really? Okay, well, I guess I won't say it out loud then. I think the look on my face convinced him that there must have been something terrible to have happened for me not wanting to say this simple word. We chatted for a few more minutes and he left. This simple conversation nearly evaporated as I went throughout my day of normal policing. One of my deputies got very sick that week and had to call out. I had to cover his area and totally forgot to assign someone to watch over the witness protection family. I didn't realize the blunder I made until it was too late. It was nighttime and I got a strange notification on my cell phone which I'd never gotten before. It was as if someone was calling me, but when I looked down at my phone, my entire screen was red. It showed an address which I immediately knew to be the witness protection family. The security system had automatically called the father who I'd spoken to only a few days prior. He answered immediately and seemed to have gotten the same notification I did. He sounded panicked. I told him that his daughter needed to immediately hide until we got there, but as I said this, he told me that he could see on his cell phone that there was already someone inside the house. I told him to call his daughter and to tell her to run into the field next to the forest. If it was a local intruder, they would know better than to follow her so close to the forest that late at night. If it wasn't a local, then let's just hope that the cornfield provides enough cover until I get there. He agreed and hung up the phone and I sped off to their address. I was the second to the scene since their distant neighbor, who was asked by their parents to stop by, was already there. The front door was broken down and the living room area looked to be trashed with muddy footprints all over. I assumed those to be the intruders. The boot print trail led almost immediately to what looked like the girl's room. The window to the room was wide open. I went back to the living room and asked the neighbor if they saw anything, and he said he didn't. Right then entered a girl covered in dirt and she began shouting nonsense at us. I was so confused at what she was saying, I didn't remember what her father had told me until the farmer reminded me that she was indeed deaf. We handed her a pen and paper and she told us that there was something out in the field with her. It got the intruder. The farmer and I both looked at each other with terrified looks on our faces, as we both knew the folklore of that terrible incident. After about half an hour or so, the farmer and I both were able to get the girl to calm down, and she went home with him, seeing that he was a family friend of the family. We roped off the crime scene but didn't investigate the field until the next day, for, protocol. The next morning revealed some corn stalks being destroyed, as well as random puddles of blood and bits and pieces of torn clothes. Unfortunately, having investigated the field the next day, most of the evidence had been scavenged by birds and other small animals. I would like to say that this was the end of the story, where everything went back to normal, where the family was relocated to another town in another state, and that our town went back to normal. But that wasn't true. The family wasn't relocated, and the town definitely didn't go back to normal. If anything, it made things worse. After the incident, I became rather invested in this family. I felt as if that, by watching this family, I would be able to gain an insight to what had happened in that field. I think whatever happened in that field was clearly connected to what happened in that forest those many years ago when I was a child. The family was not able to move quite yet for whatever reason, but we beefed up surveillance until the FBI was able to find another place and another identity. I kept an eye on the family, personally through the security system that let me look inside the family's home. Personally, it felt a bit invasive, but those were my orders. A couple of weeks later, I got a notification one night. It was the same kind of notification as the time before when the girl was home alone. However, this time both parents were there. It was about 2 in the morning and the home was dark. I saw on my phone that a figure had entered the residence from the back door, facing the field, and stood there. I got out of bed quickly, got dressed in normal clothes, and sped off to the address that I now knew by heart. It didn't take me long to reach the address, and thankfully there was another squad car there out front. I rushed inside, seeing that the front door was opened, and there stood the wife speaking to the officer, who was taking notes. The father was nowhere to be seen, and I was told upon arriving that the girl was still asleep. The mother was speaking to the officer on the scene, and I walked around the home to see what was going on. Apparently, someone had entered the home from the back door, and the father went to investigate while armed with a firearm. The mother didn't hear a struggle, or any discharge of any kind of firearm. She only came out to open the door for the officer when he arrived. The back door was still open, and there were muddy footprints that walked around the home. The footprints did not look normal. That's the only way I can really describe it. The footprints definitely looked human in some way, but they were not wearing shoes of any kind, which was clearly odd. I walked outside the back door and looked towards the field, and even the forest that lay behind it. I stared for longer than I realized. What snapped me out of my trance was a surprising discovery. I could see barely with the aid of my flashlight a figure just standing in the inside of the cornfield, back towards me. The sight frightened me, however I quickly called out, and the figure was responsive. After a brisk walk down to the cornfield, I saw that it was the father of the family. He walked up to me with wide eyes and a look of disbelief. He was much different than the skeptical man I spoke to only weeks prior. "What do we know about this thing?" he asked sternly. "Not much. We just stay away from this area, if I'm being completely honest," I responded. I could tell that whatever just occurred had changed this man from being an unbeliever, even a critic of some beliefs, to someone who was just face to face with some terrible type of evil. We finally both walked inside, and I offered to stay the night watching the forest from my car, but they declined. We locked up the back door, and the other officer and I ended up leaving not much later. Things began to get weird after that. The father of the family, let's call him Jeff, became oddly obsessed with the forest just beyond the cornfield. He would text me just about every other day or so with updates with new information he found online. He told me he thinks it could be a number of things. He thinks it might be a demon that the cult had summoned and now haunts the woods. He texted me another day thinking it was something that didn't even exist in this dimension. I shared with him what we all thought the creature was, and I didn't say the name for obvious reasons, but he thought differently. He then began sending pictures of different things he would find. Some were from his house, while others were out in the field. Jeff was clearly not afraid of the forest, but rather fixated on what lived out there. Out of nowhere, the texts and phone calls from Jeff abruptly stopped. I, for one, figured he finally got over what was going on and had moved on. I kept watch from my smartphone on the security system to see how things were going. The mother and daughter seemed to be living a somewhat normal life, however Jeff was acting very strange. I would notice he would sometimes stand in places for a very long time, sometimes facing a window while other times just standing in a corner. I just thought that Jeff was going through a hard time in his life in a weird way. Although Jeff was acting weird, I wasn't concerned. It wasn't until a couple of days later I noticed I hadn't seen the mother in any of the security footage. I figured I was due for an in-person wellness check, so I drove to the home late one Saturday afternoon. Lisa, the daughter, answered the door after I rang the doorbell, which alerted the system that flashed lights to notify her. This time I remembered that she was deaf and brought a pen and paper just for her. Lisa was kind enough to speak to me, although that she couldn't hear, she could definitely read lips. She told me that she could understand as long as she could see what I was saying. Oh, neat. I didn't know that. "Hey, is your mother home by chance?" I asked. Lisa shook her head and gave me a small frown. "Do you know where she is?" Lisa gave me another head shake and a bigger frown. "Where's your father?" I asked. She waved her hand to follow her inside and led me to the living room. Standing in the living room stood Jeff, but he was facing a corner and just stood there. I had seen this on the security footage, but something about seeing this in real life really scared me. It was as if Jeff had no idea I was even there. I looked back at Lisa and she told me that something was wrong. She told me that she felt something coming from the floor which she had never felt before, a couple days ago. I didn't understand what she was trying to say. "You felt something on the floor?" I was confused. She then explained to me that she thinks there's something in the basement hitting the floor above. "Oh, where's your basement?" I asked. She guided me over to a door that was heavily locked. She told me that about a week ago her father had placed these locks on the door, and she hadn't been able to go down there. I glanced over to the living room and saw that Jeff had not moved. He was clearly not doing well. I went out to the garage and found a hammer and smashed the few exterior locks that covered the door. I told Lisa to follow me into the basement because I didn't want her to be alone upstairs with her dad like this. Once I opened the door, I clearly alerted something that laid waiting in the dark basement below. I hit the switch to the lights, but nothing turned on. Of course, I said to myself. I pulled out my gun and my flashlight and started walking down the stairs. Lisa followed me, and as we went down the stairs, I began to hear muffled sounds coming from deeper in the basement. I reached the bottom of the stairs and shined my light around. I kept Lisa behind me, and she wisely gripped tightly onto the hammer that I used to break the locks on the basement door. The moans were coming from another door that had the same kind of locks as the basement door. I handed Lisa my light and traded her for the hammer. I broke the locks and grabbed my light back from Lisa. I slowly opened the door to reveal the most horrific thing I'd ever see. Inside the room were the remains of the mother, which were not much. All that remained was a head and a various amount of bones that still had chunks of meat on them. Next to the mother was Jeff, the real Jeff. Jeff was still alive, but barely. His legs and one of his arms had been removed. Jeff was chained to a support beam in the basement that had scratch marks and blood going down it. His mouth was covered with duct tape, and even before poor Lisa removed the tape, I knew that Jeff was trying to warn her this whole time by hitting the beam in desperate hopes to get her attention. I immediately called this in and went upstairs to confront whatever it was that was impersonating Jeff. By the time I got upstairs, whatever it was gone. The back door was wide open. The report, despite my lengthy and personal testimony to what actually happened, according to the FBI, that the Mafia had finally gotten a hold of the family. My police station was held somewhat responsible for not providing adequate protection, but the courts ruled in our favor that the FBI failed to relocate them fast enough. My station, as well as the entire town, caught wind of the entire story, and now refuse to have anything to do with those woods. The farmers that would once plant crops in the field have refused to utilize it anymore. I don't blame them. As for me, I'm just waiting. I know that these first couple of events will be the first of many. I think after this first incident, the creature became somehow hungrier. I think it's up to me to somehow find a way to put a stop to it.